minister to children and youth, and we are going to be hearing tonight. I'm excited to hear from Dr. Green, and yes, we'll get there in just a second, but first thing, if you are a newcomer, we have little cards on the table, and we would love for you to fill out some information for us. It doesn't include any your social security number or anything, but just like fill that out. And there's also a QR code if you want to fill out our online card. If you're watching live streamed or if you're watching this later and you want to fill out an online visitor card, there's one on our website. It's very easy to fill out, and we would love to be in contact with you. Second thing is if you have a question during the talk, there are note cards on the table. And you can wave them in the air at a certain point that will be designated, I think, very clearly. And we will come and get your cards and kind of go through them, and we'll have a Q&A, I was going to say Q&A, question and answer sort of time where you will be able to ask questions of Dr. Green. So next, I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Brian Gamble. Dr. Gamble is a postdoc at Truett Seminary, and he is newly on our vestry at St. Albans. So give it up for Dr. Gamble.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that warm welcome. I get the distinct honor of introducing our speaker for tonight. And let me just say, first of all, that I have gotten to know Lance over the last several months and year, and I would consider him a friend, and the kind of friend that I would want at my back in a bar fight, but also who I would trust my children and my animals with. So this is the kind of person that I think that he is. Dr. Lance Green recently completed his PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He focused his research on the intersection of Eastern Orthodox iconography and contemporary philosophy. So, cocktail conversation. And more generally, Lance is interested in theology's relationship to art and the philosophical interpretations of modern technology. Lance is a native of the Pacific Northwest, home of the Goonies, and grew up in Alaska and Central Oregon. His wife, Dr. Rachel Toombs, who many of you will know, is the director of formation here at St. Albans. She refuses to move to Alaska because of her fear of bears, which really, really frustrates Lance, but he's fine. It's just fine. It is my distinct honor tonight to introduce and welcome Dr. Lance Green. Please welcome him.
This is so much more awkward than I expected. There's nothing better than starting a night out with getting someone to make a joke about your wife who works here and everybody loves. So I apologize to anyone who's agitated. Also, I know that this event was supposed to be Wednesday. I know we had horrible weather and, just mounds of snow, and it was really dangerous to drive. Sorry, this is what happens when you grow up in snow. You're kind of insensitive to Texans who don't know how to drive in it. But then it's there's a flip side, is that when it's 80 degrees, I'm miserable and I complain. And the Texans are wearing jackets and they're like, oh man, it's only 80 degrees out. So that's, it always sort of swings both ways. And it's cool too, I think, as someone who doesn't go to this church, but kind of goes to this church, because I kind of know half of you. Which makes me kind of question what you guys would normally do on a Friday, because I feel like you know me well enough to know that this could be just sheer madness. Buckle up, buttercup. No, I'm joking. I'm a very normal person. So I should have written something. I've just been joking with people that I didn't write anything, and I wish I would have now. It's all just in here. So one of the reasons that I thought that it would be really good to talk about consumerism and the end of the world is kind of because I think there's a lot of fall narratives and sort of apocalyptic visions, right, of our future. There's always some sort of religious or political group that thinks that our communities and our culture is on this like train that's heading toward its demise. It all feels kind of sensationalist, right? Like street preachers or people that like stand there in the rain with signs that say the end is nigh. Always in the rain, I don't know why. So I want to also pre-apologize for being the guy standing here with the proverbial sign that says the end is nigh. Now I'm holding this sign not because I actually have a right to judge anyone about consumerism. I am not a monk. I'm married, obviously, not a monk. I don't live out in the wilderness. I don't stitch my own clothes. I don't grow my own food. I own a PlayStation. I play too many video games, frankly. And, I drive a decent car. I have nice bicycles that I don't ride. Now I just feel like I need to confess like all the money I spend and like the resources I'm wasting. But it's actually precisely because I don't have this figured out that I thought it would be good to hang out with people I know and then people I don't know to kind of have this conversation about our consumerism, because it's kind of a problem. And the world that's ending in this, I think, very well-titled talk is the world that we don't see. Right? It's not that we walk around every day feeling like the sky is about to collapse. That's precisely what isn't happening. But there is a world behind what we consume that is being destroyed. There is a measurable cost in people's lives and on creation in the way that we consume goods. And this actually does something to us. Consumerism or consumer culture isn't just something I simply choose to engage in, or perhaps don't choose to engage in. It's just really not that simple. Rather, our consumerism becomes a lens from which we interpret the world. It's a lot like a pair of glasses, except they don't actually make our vision clear. Rather, the glasses obscure our vision. They make it harder to see. And there's a lot of ways that we can approach this theologically. Scripture and the saints through history have had a lot to say about wealth and about poverty and about having excess. But the thing that has been most challenging and apparent to me is that my consumerism, right, these glasses that I'm wearing that are lenses from which I see the world, that it stops me from seeing where God actually says he is present. And it doesn't really help me cultivate sympathy or love, either for the stranger or for the earth. I don't have a lot of commitment to the world I live in beyond fulfilling my own wants and desires. And we'll talk a little bit more about the theological stuff there at the end, but I want to take some time to consider precisely what this consumerism is doing to us. Now, to be clear, despite me holding this proverbial sign of the end is nigh, humans have always kind of been critters interested in themselves, right? Self-interest did not just like arise yesterday. Even if you like go talk to my parents, right, who are always the sort of folks who are like, well, man, like these younger generations. But there's lots of problems with younger generations, cell phones. But self-centeredness is something that's kind of been around for a bit. But a lot of historians and political philosophers have spent a lot of time thinking about what it is that's given rise to our consumer culture. Now, I'm going to paint with very, very broad brushstrokes here, but we can sort of say that a lot that makes up our consumer culture started roughly 50 years ago. So there was this time, or so the narrative goes, where we were more committed to sort of the flourishing of local communities and to mutual flourishing. And what ended up sort of happening was a prioritization of our own self-flourishing. So the rise of this individualism is also around the same time as economies became increasingly global and technological progress exploded. I'm only in my mid-30s, I distinctly remember a world without the internet, where TVs were incredibly big and incredibly boxy. And then by the time I was in college, people had smartphones. So I remember these two very distinct times, even in my relatively young life. And so the narrative goes, we began to understand the main function of our various political processes as creating neutral spaces to be individuals, for citizens to pursue their own flourishing, and being even pursuing their own values. We are increasingly disinterested in being told what our values should be, but rather want systems to support our autonomy and our independence, which perhaps we could also interpret as an attempt to be unencumbered by social responsibility. Poet and essayist Wendell Berry likens our consumer culture to that of a one-night stand. We enter, don't giggle at that, this is serious stuff. I actually took a lot of time to consider whether or not I should try to find another idiom, but I figured, just go with it. Episcopalians have good senses of humor. That's enough chuckles. That makes me feel better about it. Sorry, Aaron. So one night stands, right? So we enter into clandestine transactions with total anonymity. The transaction is made, we part ways, and the world behind the product remains completely foreign and out of view. It's almost as if we actually have no sustained memory, no intimacy one could even recall. We simply move on. But Barry says, quote, we buy new stuff on the promise of satisfaction because we've forgotten the promised satisfaction from which we bought our old stuff, end quote. And so we perpetually enter into new clandestine transactions, often for the same product, in continued failed attempts at satisfaction. And this becomes a habit for us, what Barry calls a persistent want for satisfaction that is fundamentally rooted in our anonymity and ignorance of the world that is behind what we buy. And as such, the whole network of people and habitats that relate to that product are absent from our vision. And as a whole, we don't know or see where these products have come from. We don't know even necessarily what they're made of. We have no idea as to the hands that touched them or assembled them. So I mentioned earlier the idea that consumerism becomes a pair of glasses, a lens, right, that we see the world through. The funny thing about glasses, of course, is you kind of get used to them. So whether it's, sunglasses when it's sunny outside, or if it's just prescription lenses you use day to day, once you've worn the glasses for long enough, you don't really think about them anymore. They become just extensions of your daily rhythms, your comings and goings. But the habituation of constantly looking to fulfill our desire becomes a way of interpreting the world. So when we are stuck in our patterns of consumption, wearing these glasses as constantly as we do, we can't help but frame the world in a particular way. That is, as something that we can consume. That is to say, preceding any intentional action or thought, we often reduce the world to a stockpile of materials. And from that stockpile, we can take whatever we want in order to produce and consume more product. Now, we might rationally say, I'm pretty sure I don't interpret the world as a stockpile of stuff for me to consume. And I mean that. I don't look at Cameron Park and think to myself, oh man, I want all the iron ore that might be inside of Cameron Park. This is not really how we, rationally think about the world. But the point here is that consumerism orients us in a particular direction, and we can be totally unaware of our own bearing. And we forget that we are wearing glasses. And so our habits betray what we might assert about the way we view the world. We're so in it, if you will, that we don't see how truly oriented we are into simply fulfilling our desires through stuff. So we fail to see the impact then on the lives of people and on the land in the most normal and inane things that we buy. Let's consider the world behind the fashion industry. The outsourcing of materials and the production of the product often doesn't pay a livable wage, subjects both adults and children to working horribly long and grueling hours. They are exposed to toxic chemicals and dangerous machinery. And the owners and operators of these factories have total control. There are no unions, especially because the poverty rates in these places promises throngs of potential workers looking for any possible income to continue surviving. Companies based in the US outsource their production because it's cheap and because they can pass a portion of what they've saved to their consumers, us. The products themselves, of course, don't last. Indeed, they're not really made to. And so it brings us back to repurchase these products over and over again. And because each purchase asks nothing of us, while promising some menial satisfaction, we can easily fail to investigate and concern ourselves with the whole unjust system behind the thing, the system that knowingly takes advantage of poverty and desperation. The ecological effects of the products we buy are similarly pervasive. Smartphones, my favorite, have the highest environmental impact of any consumer electronic product on the market. There are 3.5 billion smartphone users. A vast majority of these products do not get recycled. That's a serious problem because the mining of the essential materials and the metals for these smartphones, I keep saying iPhones, it's all Apple's fault, for these smartphones is incredibly toxic and famously unregulated. And such has been responsible for the destruction of coral reefs and is one of the major contributors to the deforestation of the Amazon and has rendered tens of thousands of square miles barren wastelands from which very few creatures can survive. I don't actually have this in any of my notes. I saw on NPR just this morning about the mining of essential metals in the Congo. We all remember there was a time of these deep concerns about blood diamonds, and now we have this new concern about the bloodshed over the mining of metals for our smartphones. Our use of automobiles, to pivot to another really cool thing, along with the production and transportation of every other product that we buy, makes up a significant portion of our use of fossil fuels, which is the central cause of our current and ever worsening climate crisis. We are already seeing warmer global temperatures, more droughts, longer wildfire seasons, and the melting of the ice caps. And these rising oceans will erode coastlines, increase the destructive power of hurricanes, and decimate wildlife populations across the globe. By 2050, the expectation is that climate change will produce roughly 1 billion refugees, most of whom will be from countries that already lack resources, clean water, and sustainable food. These facts about industry and our consumption of goods are actually very easily found. It was the easiest thing to find, in fact, as I sort of thought about this. And I actually think that most folks are probably aware that there is some kind of climate problem, right? It probably comes up on the news every so often, and the facts don't really seem to reorient us. I have been incredibly aware of these issues. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, which now has massive droughts, lots of wildfires, old growth forests that are old and beautiful and rich are gone. I still own a PlayStation, right? So it doesn't really do anything to wake us up. Now, maybe it's because these horrible outcomes are just so difficult to wrap our head around, or because they're just global problems. And we all know that a single person or a single household is actually not going to change the course of American or global cultures. These can be really difficult problems to wrestle with. So hear me when I say this is not like, let's fix this right now. This is really hard stuff. Most of us aren't wrestling with it. But nonetheless, we are in the middle of it. So the challenge becomes learning to see differently by becoming attentive, learning to put on another pair of glasses, to not habitually enter into these clandestine transactions and change the way we are oriented, both towards what we're buying and the root of the desire that we have to sort of consistently fulfill our desires through things. It means taking seriously how to consume less, but it also means attending to the world behind and fixing something inside. And that means seeing those who Christ attended to. Here comes the theology bit I mentioned. And it means seeing God in creation and attending to the divine presence there. And to be clear, sure, yes, we do need to avoid shopping with brands that have really, really bad labor practices. We need to buy phones less. We need to buy greener vehicles, supposedly. But this doesn't actually fix the problem, right? It doesn't fix what's going on here. It doesn't actually give us new glasses and new ways of seeing. Because if we know one thing about consumer culture and industry, it's that if they find this thing that's really helpful and cool and can be energy efficient, they're gonna find this way to monetize it, and then they're gonna resell it to you, and then you're wearing all this green clothes, and you're just buying all this green. I wear so much Patagonia, it's horrible. And it's really green, guys, and they don't have as much slave labor. It's cool. You have a lot of t-shirts, man. Chill. Stop buying flannels. It's literally 100 degrees out 9 months a year. Sorry, I just get into this confession thing. I apologize. I have more to say somewhere in my notes, but now I'm in this confession mode. I apologize. So, challenge is we need to become more attentive. Now, our attention is pulled in 1,000 directions. Work, family, entertainment, housework, friends, our own sort of intuitive impulses to take care of ourselves. And some of this we just sort of do habitually, right? Others, it's just it's autopilot. You don't even think about it. It's the opposite of me cleaning the house. And then others sort of reach out at you and they grab your attention and they demand that you focus right then and there. But then others require quite a bit of intentionality, where you need to put it front and center to truly see it, to really be attuned to it, to attend. And it's important to understand we have within ourselves the power to put things front and center, to make something the focus of our attention. But so much of our life fades into the background. Things that are far away or feel too big or too complex are forced out of our field of vision, and they recede into the background. But in doing so, the thing isn't gone. It's still somewhere in our subconscious. Our attention's just elsewhere. There's a theologian out of Austin, Jonathan Heaps. He ties our attentiveness to being inquisitive and intelligent critters. The things we encounter will impose questions. These questions will challenge assumptions. They will challenge habits and perhaps demand something of us. He says that as such, we are faced with a choice. Will we ignore, wave away, or suppress the tug of these questions? Will we judge in advance that their answers are not worth knowing? Or will we attune ourselves, ratify them, and give voice to them? Will we hold these questions that express our intelligence out in front of us and follow them where they lead? Because only you can acknowledge them and can articulate their substance, can follow their call to deeper understanding. And so, I think the challenge then is learning to be attentive to the worlds being destroyed behind our culture of consumerism, to be attentive and ask questions of ourselves, our habits, our rituals, and our ability or inability to be sympathetic and merciful. It takes legitimate moral courage to see what often recedes into the background and pull it from the background and put it front and center. We must become attentive to who Christ was attentive to. We must become attentive to God's presence in the whole of creation. It is an overwhelmingly dominant theme in the Gospels that Christ came to preach the good news to the poor. He really doesn't mince words about this. I know we get very concerned sometimes about the way we can politicize these things, but it is there, and it is indisputable. He proclaims very clearly that he came to bring sight to the blind, to heal the lame and the sick, and to bring good news to the poor. In fact, Jesus so identifies with the poor and the downtrodden that he says, well, if you show them mercy, then it's the same as doing it to me. We've all heard this famous quote, just as you did to the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me. It can be very concerning sometimes when we read the Bible literally. Similarly, God's presence in creation is a dominant theme throughout Scripture and through the history of Christian thought. We actually can summarize this theme with Paul's famous line in Romans. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood through the things he has made. And the church has never shied away from declaring that our contemplation of the visible world, the stuffs that make up everything, we can see God. This isn't actually something they argued for. Like if you go read like all the old theologians, none of them are like, oh, we're going to argue why we see God in creation. It's just an assumption that they made. And then throughout history, it kind of gets teased out in these different ways. In fact, the idea that God became flesh, that he became human, made of the stuff of existence, sort of declares that creation itself is good. To even handle material things is to touch the matter through which our salvation has been brought to pass. So we must learn to be attentive, to have spiritual eyes to register and bring into focus where Christ is said to be present, the poor and creation. I'm going to conclude with more confession. I apologize. The Eastern Orthodox Church is like really into confession, so it just like builds this habit. So I want to conclude by just saying, having a PhD in theology doesn't actually give you spiritual insight. Like you should have gone to some of my seminars. Like we are not necessarily decent or like Christ-loving people. We're just like we just read books. Joking, I can't even read now. I've read some books. So I'm not going to pretend to be like particularly wise, and I'm quite certain. I tried to write this different ways. I'm certain I'll never be a saint. I was going to say like, oh, I suspect I'll never be one. I'm certain I'll never be a saint. I fail day in, day out. I don't really see the world behind my own consumerism. So don't take this as me being preachy. I am not good at being attentive. I actually once confessed this to an Orthodox priest acquaintance of mine, that I struggled to take seriously what the gospel called me to do, to see where God is present. And I think that's because when you read theology and you read the saints, you kind of get this picture of like what holiness looks like. And then all you do is you compare yourself to them, right? Like literally, like men and women who were monks and like committed their entire existence to like loving people and like being contemplative. I own a PlayStation, remember? So this has like developed a complex in me, right? And he responded with a question that kind of laid everything bare. He's like, oh yeah, so like how much do you pray? So like my answer was like very akin to that awkward silence that I had right there. I just didn't, I was like, yeah, I like pray. And it's like a priest, right? It's like you feel like you need to like have this like puffed upness of like, no, I'm like a Christian in some ways. But yeah, no, the answer was like, I don't even remember like the last time I did. So to see God's presence in the midst of the people and the creation that my consumerism adversely affects requires attentiveness to prayer. To be satisfied by something other than the built-in habit to have more stuff requires prayer. It requires silence, intentionality, and being receptive to God's work in you and in the world. In prayer, so the wisdom of the scriptures and of the saints say we can come to see see the world as God sees it, to have our vision change and to see with spiritual eyes his presence in the poor, the suffering, and in his creation. So I know I've offered very few practical steps as to what to do about the end of these worlds, so I'm kind of sorry about that. But my hope is that I've generated some questions for the Q&A, and then we can kind of keep this conversation rolling. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry, that's very loud. Thank you so much, Dr. Green, for commentary on your PlayStation and consumerism.
Yeah.
If you have questions that this talk has generated, then take one of the note cards that is at your table. You can write it down, and you can pass it around. Someone will be around to collect them and give them to me if you don't feel like talking. If you do feel like talking, then we will have people with microphones throughout the area who will crisscross around, and or I will use the microphone. We're just going to use just use the paper. No talking. You cannot talk. Just write. We're going to write all your questions down, and then I will read them off. So while you were thinking,
My wife is losing her voice, so we should be attentive.
yeah, that'd be a great idea. So you can ask questions or write them down, either way. We all know how this works. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first question while all of you are formulating your questions as well. I have a question, Lance, about this relationship between being a consumer and consumerism. And so you mention, I think helpfully, that there is no getting out of being a consumer. All of us have to go to H-E-B or to Aldi and to buy our food. We all have to clothe ourselves, etc. And yet, how is it? You hint at this idea about what it looks like to be a consumer and not be caught up in consumerism. But what would that space look like even at an intellectual level, or before we even get to the actions that we would do? And so, for example, let me just say, and for my own confession, I'm a terrible recycler. I found out a few years ago that all of our plastic that was shipped to China now is just burned in the trash. Yes, thank you. So that was incredibly demotivational for my already terrible, lackluster efforts to recycle. It's possible that a lot of people can hear a discussion like this and think, well, I'm already kind of wrapped up in consumerism. I might as well just, I'm never going to be like St. Anthony and give away all my possessions. What's the use? What would you tell someone in that kind of situation?
All right, I've got two answers to the question. The nicer answer, and the answer that's more digestible, is we need to legitimately learn to consume less stuff. And we need to legitimately learn to consume less stuff because people's lives actually depend on it. And it's really easy, like I said, for them to become invisible. And it's very easy to think that the Amazon or coral reefs are really far away. Problems that are really far away are really easy to ignore. And I have a really hard time trying to reckon in myself that I would tell God in the end that it was just sort of inopportune. Because I don't think that's an answer that is going to resound nicely. That's the nicer answer. The meaner answer, and I say this only because I spend a lot of time reading people who live monastic lives, And I've known people who've lived a very monastic life. The people that I have met that I think are probably saints that one day could be venerated and could like have churches named after them are not people who buy a new car every 5 years. They're not people who care whatsoever about the clothes that they're owning as far as like the prestige of brands. They live very simple, quiet lives where they're not sort of filling everything with entertainment. I don't know how to do that. Like I said, I own a PlayStation. Like I own mountain bikes and these sorts of things. And every time I talk with these people, I'm like struck by the fact that they have something figured out. And it is a life that is embedded in simplicity and prayer and a commitment to seeing God in all the things and recognizing that so many of the things sort of get in the way of that. So yeah, maybe no nice answers on that one. Sorry. Yeah.
And we will now move to other questions where we will see, we can measure the barometer of niceness on these other answers. If you have questions, again, you can write them down and send them up my way, or if you are so bold, you can raise your hand and call it out. We're going to read this next question here, but again, feel free to write these down. Okay, I'm going to read this out. This is a bit of a long question, and I'm just reading it for the first time. So
you should read it first, just to be clear.
The problems of consumerism certainly require an attentiveness we need to cultivate, but it also requires sacrifice and self-control, a move to a decidedly un-American way of life, one that emphasizes communal good over individual freedom. What are concrete ways that churches like St. Alban's can embody such postures in our communities? What does attentiveness look like for this church?
I'm also losing my voice very suddenly. Let me, who does not attend this here church, where my wife works and collects her paycheck from, make an incredibly bold statement. I think a lot of it also comes down, so I think there's a few ways to answer this. One of them is with space. This is a very big, beautiful space. Finding ways to use the resources of this space for the community, which I think St. Albans is actually not bad at, and I think is continue to strive to do. And I think, I've known Aaron for a good while now, and I think one of the things that makes St. Albans what it is this sort of like unrelenting commitment to like what the gospel does to transform lives. And there's actually something really important about that, to like, hey, stay the course, that like Jesus is up to something and like the Holy Spirit's gonna do work. Sanctification is real, union with God is real, and to become more united with God is to see, right? And I think the thing I don't want to say, but like I'm here, so I may as well. And it's like a lot easier for me to avoid all of you since I don't go here. Is I think like an internal culture of the church being committed to like do otherwise. Part of that question has this sort of comment on like American culture. We all recall, I like to call them Trump bucks. Remember when the like pandemic first hit and the government was like, people don't have money, like we gotta make sure people are spending. So right, they started writing checks to ensure that the impoverished would like actually be able to buy some groceries. They were small checks, but they made a dent. Economists were deeply concerned when people started putting them in their savings account. If you recall, I was always told that I need to save 10% of everything I make. I need to have 3 to 4 months worth of money in my savings account for like whatever my salary was, so that if there's like a rainy day, I can afford to do all these things, right? The Dave Ramsey thing, here's how you kill your debt, here's how much money you have set aside. And then the economy is about to collapse because people didn't consume stuff for 3 weeks. The economy is built on stilts. And the water is a-rising. And that's kind of the difficult thing of the consumer culture, and it's the thing that I actually circled around talking about a little bit. I am not an economist. I'm also really bad at math, because I got humanities degrees, y'all. But everything points in this direction. To actually fix the economy, to actually fix the ecological problems and the issues of our consumption generally, is not going to get fixed by buying a Tesla. Also because the mining of everything with those batteries is also incredibly atrocious on nature. But to have a technological problem and a consumeristic problem is not fixed by consuming more different things. Politically, and I suspect I will see this in my lifetime, there will probably need to be a shrinkage of the economy in general. And that is the practical thing that no one really knows how to think or talk about, because we are actually talking about shifting the entire first and developing world in a different direction. And if we know anything from history, this usually happens in and amongst tragedy. So whenever that tragedy strikes and it registers loud enough, we will probably figure that out. Man, I'm just filled with answers to make everyone's day awesome.
So I feel like this may be a sequitur off of what you just said. I think a lot of times personally when I think about these kinds of questions and how to address them, I feel a pretty overwhelming sense of exhaustion in the face of okay, yeah, sure. Okay, today I can think about the ecological devastation of mining lithium, and I can also think about the horrible toxic dye that's running into waterways in the third world where they dye jeans, and I could build this really long list of things that's gonna super bum me out.
I'm sorry, I'm really sorry to add to that bumming, man.
I mean, I think that's a really natural reaction.
Yeah.
And I also don't really feel like it's particularly productive, to be perfectly honest. That doesn't really make me do anything. It just sort of stresses me out.
Yeah.
So I wonder what it looks like for you to imagine a more joyful and productive reaction to this sort of overwhelming sense of oh, this is really bad news. This whole life that I've been taught to live is devastating another world that I don't see.
I mentioned Wendell Berry earlier. Raise of hands if you've heard of Wendell Berry or read Wendell Berry. This is a dope church. There's a lot of hands. Wendell Berry is wonderful, and he's a smart fellow. I mean, he thinks like an academic, but he writes beautiful poetry and great essays, and I really mean it. Everyone should read Wendell Berry. And the thing that's really great about Wendell Berry is he understands that we can't just go be farmers and then live this agrarian life as a farmer. I don't know. Where I'm from, the land to go be a farmer would be tens of millions of dollars, and it's probably owned by a tech bro from San Francisco anyway. So there's no farming being done on this. He's working, drinking kombucha and working. I don't know what these people do. But the thing that he understands is that local economy really matters. Buy as much food as you can, if you can afford it, from local places. Get your produce locally. Get your food locally. Buy used clothes. Cherish the things that local people do. That's one of the cool things about doing an event like this at East Side Revival, where it's really, really good food. Most of it's locally sourced. Also, their people get financially very well taken care of, right? No one's making $7.50 an hour and then an extra $2 an hour on tips or something. And they're legitimately making money to be able to actually thrive and sort of move with their lives. This is kind of what it begins to look like. And I think you can really take joy in this because then you are committed to a community, to mutual flourishing. And there are ways, I think, to realign our expectations of the kinds of stuff we have, because we do actually need clothes, and we do need shoes. The problem is when the shoes last 6 months, the clothes are $15, and it falls apart in 3.5 months, and you're just buying it all the time. So I think it's a real commitment to doing local stuff, and to be clear, this is not a politic where I would be a Marxist. To be clear, I'm not a communist, politics are very complicated, but I am not a communist or a Marxist, nor do I think that like what we need to have is some kind of like state-run solution for everything. But we also need to understand that like our very being is being asked of us to do something. And there is a lot going on in a little town like Waco that we can actually do. But it's really hard, and I think that you will find the joy once you commit to as localized of an economy for both like your food and your clothing and your entertainment as possible. I don't know if that answers the question. This guy also works at Balcones, right? Which is like this fantastic whiskey place that's like one of the most famous in North America right outside of Waco, or right inside of Waco, excuse me. So there is this like irony of this guy like asking this question, being all bummed out. And he's like, oh, well, how do you do this? Yeah, man, like you go to Balcones, right? Like this is how you kind of do it. Like you go to the local places, and like that is kind of where the culture comes from, and you drink responsibly.
On the topic of creating change is our next question. Being attentive sounds a lot like mindfulness. But can a few people meditating change the trajectory you described?
Can a few people meditating? I don't know. I think that's one of the reasons why I shy away from just trying to think about this issue as like a political problem, where like I need to vote in a certain way and like call my representative to like not suck and like do these sorts of things. Like it's like that's kind of where like the distance of the problem can be really, really difficult. And there are these moments where like Jesus and like the scriptures have like some pretty serious thing to say about like systemic problems. But like, and this is like something Aaron gets every Sunday. It's like the gospel is for you. Like, who did Jesus die for? Oh, yeah, like for you. Justification is for you. So everything about even like prayer and this attempt to not be so consumed by these cultural pressures, it's also because like, hey man, like the gospel is for you. And this prayerful life is for your union and to see the world that you are a part of more holistically and I think more Christianly. So I don't know if that actually answers the question. I don't know how we just change the world. Like I'm also like not that guy. Like I'm not changing the world. But I would really hope that I can like take seriously what it means to be a Christian enough to like change myself to actually see the people that are on the margins that I just like frankly ignore.
This next question, again, if you have other questions and you'd like to write them down, we can still take a few more of those, or if you have them here, you want to raise your hand, that will also work. I'm going to read the next one, though, on here, which is a different direction, and one that perhaps you would appreciate more personally. Can you give an icon, maybe they mean an example of an icon, that could inspire the kind of virtue you have in mind here?
Well, that is too good of a question. So just to sort of provide context, the idea here is what kind of piece of like religious art, of iconography. There was actually an image earlier up here of an icon.
Maybe you can briefly explain icons and iconography for those of us not.
All right, guys.
Briefly was the key.
Yeah, I can do this. All right, so iconography is actually very simple. It is just that in the ancient church all the way up to today, there have been images made of both saints and of Jesus and of Mary and of scenes in Scripture, and these icons for the Orthodox and for certain kinds of Catholics who read the right stuff. We venerate these images. We kiss them, we respect them, because we believe there's some kind of like distant presence of whomever is depicted in the image. So the question then is, what kind of image or icon can help cultivate this kind of virtue? man, that's almost an unfair question. Like, that should have been given to me, like, this morning for me to contemplate. Hopefully they'll show it later. Your church is doing something on, I think it's a concert that's coming up, maybe Handel's Messiah, and there's actually an image there of a mosaic of Christ. Yeah, someone knows the thing. Hey, that one. So there's something very interesting about iconography, because the idea is that these are kind of meant to be tools to help us pray, to help us meditate. And one of the things that we're sort of want to do is to really interpret these images as like an encounter with a person, right? We are looking into the eyes of Christ, we're looking at an icon, and the icon looks back. And I think what's always behind the icon, of course, is this sort of rich biblical reality that you already know, right? Of Christ's crucifixion, of, once again, right, his love for the poor. And I think it is to see the eyes and then to encounter those eyes, to have them look back at you, is to sort of learn to see the reflection, to learn to see, to view the world through those eyes. So I have a special affection of just sort of the normal Christ icon, but also there's a really great icon, it's the name I'm going to forget, and it's Jesus carrying a lamb. And one of the reasons I really love this, and this is again something that's, I think, very sort of thematic for your own church, is that God has already gone out into the world to find the lost sheep. The distance between you and God, this massive gulf that you can experience, has already been traversed by Christ. He has already gone to found you, and he's got you like a little sheep. You know, he's holding the legs and he like throws you over. And there's something really cool about this, because I think it's a reminder that not just are you someone who's maybe weak and in need of saving, but there is this whole world out there of brokenness in need of saving, and Christ has already traversed the distance to grab the little sheep and then like plunk it over on his shoulder. And then some very wonderful painter puts that in an image. And I think it's really worth contemplating these kinds of images, because it reminds us that like mercy and weakness is the way.
Again, if you have questions that you would like to ask directly, you can raise your hand, but I will go to the, yes, right down.
Let's hear it.
Everybody is upset with the recycling, including me, young people, old people, whatever. I think we should push that more things can be recycled. So whatever companies are doing that, and I've seen this, I can't remember where, maybe on Innovation Nation, where they take all things and recycle them. I think that's what we need to push for. Why settle for that can be recycled and that can't? This can be recycled and that can't. I think that's one good place to start there.
Yeah.
Before you comment on that, just for everyone who is watching this via streaming or later, the comment was an elevation of concern for recycling. Let's make more things recyclable and push for recycling more. Is that a fair restatement?
Yeah, 85% of clothing, I think, ends up like in landfills, and a vast majority of that is not recyclable material. But of course, with product and purchasing stuff, it's usually a race to the bottom on cost. So whatever costs the least, of course, is what the materials are made from. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I don't know how to tell our president, how to do his job, though I totally would if he called me. We can chat, Joe. But no, I think you're right. Like, I think a real commitment to sustainable products is like incredibly low-hanging fruit. Like, it's kind of standing right there. And like, the worst abusers in this are just sort of like, meh. Yeah, so I suppose we need to like politically incentivize this, and people who know politics and numbers can provide ideas on how to do that.
Lance, thanks for this, man. It seems like one of the ways that questions about consumerism and the way you're having us think about so well gets so frustrating to me in the sort of non-Christian political sphere, let's say, is it's sort of an ethical question in the buffet of things you might choose to think about if you want, right? Like, if you want to be extra, if you like to go above and beyond, maybe you could think about seeing people on the margins. Maybe you could purchase differently. But if you can't, that's okay too. Who could? And it seems to me that one of the things we have as Christians is that we're delightfully burdened by a God who could care less about that this is not optional, that we have to think about these things, that, the legacy of the prophets is woe to us who ignore, the folks on the margins that you're asking us to think about. And I'm the kind of weirdo who's really galvanized by that. I don't feel judged by that, but I feel excited. Like, okay, there's a God out there who's going to call me to task for whether or not I do what I've got to do. And so I just wonder how you think about this question of the role of sort of apocalyptic thinking, not as something that necessarily is only something we have to get over, but maybe also can be a source of energy, that we're the people, hopefully, for whom these kinds of concerns are not optional, but are something that we've got to do. What does that do for you? How do you think about sort of the question of what we must do as Christians here, over and against the important emphasis, too, on mercy and weakness?
Yeah, I should have had people put questions to me this morning. I'll frame it this way. One of the things that I think is very interesting about a given, say, moment of Scripture, of judgment and condemnation, is how the Beatitudes are a great example of this, right? Like, blessed are the poor, blessed are the weak, yada, yada, yada. And some people are going to hear that and be like, oh, man, yeah, that's me. Like, this is the good news. It also cuts another way. And when you recognize yourself as not poor and not weak and all these sorts of things, you suddenly realize, God is going to cut us down, apparently. There is something very interesting about judgment. And of course, God's judgment cannot be separated from his mercy, right? This is very important because God is not actually like a big white dude in the sky who's just sort of like throwing down judgment bombs when he sees fit, right? He's not like having a temper tantrum. His love and his mercy are the exact same thing. And we're going to feel that in distinct ways. I actually think it is an incredible sign of spiritual maturity to hear that, like, hey, you need to have less stuff. You need to be unburdened by owning things. And you need to learn to, like, see the world. And that you or other people can be energized by this and actually find it to be a very easy yoke is a sign of spiritual maturity that I think a lot of people don't have. I certainly don't have, because when I am told, when I think about these things that I brought up today about trying to simplify my life, be entertained less, and be more contemplative and meditative, I'm at once like, yeah, and then at once like, oh shit. I am none of these things. Like, how do I do this? So it cuts in both ways, and I think that's what's just one of the interesting things about the gospel and what it does is, when you are on one side of Jesus' proclamation, it can really feel like God is coming down on you hard. And then others are going to feel like, yeah, this is it. This is like so refreshing and what I've been looking for. And I think this is one of the reasons I landed on attentiveness, is because, and sort of like, told that the funny story of this priest kind of like making fun of me for like, oh yeah, you're not a saint. Like, do you even pray? And it's like, no, okay, I don't pray. And that's like the place to start. Like, that's just square one. It's the first thing you do. So that people might interpret this as something to be energized by is, I think, a sign of spiritual maturity that we should actually be seeking to attain. I don't know if that answers the question, but good on you if that energizes you, because I still feel horrible for it, so.
Well, with that will be our last question, and we want to thank you, Dr. Lance Green, so much. Thank you for being here. And I'm now going to turn it back over to Stephanie for our final comments. Thank you so much.
Hello. Yeah, please
just
stand
gonna
right
stand
here.
right
Yeah.
here,
Just a few housekeeping things. First of all, thank you so much for being here. Give him another round of applause. Thank you so much.
I'm actually going to get started.
Yeah. Okay, just a few housekeeping things. If you do have a newcomer card, there's a box in the front, kind of near the doors out there. You can just stick your card in there. Another thing, if you have like liquid in your cups, don't put that in the trash can, please, because then it gets really heavy and it breaks. And there's a sink in here. Just go pour it out, and then there's trash cans over here. And let's see, what else do I have to tell you? You're welcome to hang out for a little bit. Please, there's still food, and we would love for you to eat it. So just clear it all out over there. Grab I think there's like chips and Starburst and all things like that. So grab something, put a Starburst in your pocket, and thank you so much for coming. We will be meeting at our same time next Wednesday at Revival, 6:30 to 8. And Dr. Gaynor Yancey, who is in the School of Social Work, will be our speaker for next week, talking about Legacies of Care. Dr. Yancey is amazing. She was one of my professors. I digress. Okay, thank you so much for coming, and we will see you next Wednesday.
Trying my patience, try pink carnations, red roses, and yellow daffodils. Don't forget the flowers someday, I know you will. Displays of affection and